Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 2 of the Everyday Strength Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Hagley, and this is the show where we break down what it takes to build elite strength, conditioning, and athleticism, no matter your background. Today, we'll be diving into why the Conjugate Method is one of the most misunderstood strength training systems. We'll be debunking common myths and explaining what actually works when it comes to conjugate training. We'll be discussing my experience using and adapting the conjugate principles for hybrid athletes and everyday lifters. Let's get into it. All right, everyone. So let's get into the conjugate method. First, I want to kind of break down and describe it for those who are not familiar with the conjugate method. Essentially, the conjugate method was popularized and developed by Louis Simmons from Westside Barbell. And what it is, it derives, kind of an entire system that develops multiple physical qualities simultaneously through using different types of methods, different types of training protocols. And he actually wrote the book called The Westside Book of Methods, where he kind of outlines these in extreme detail, provides great detail, great information on how you can adapt this. And that was originally geared towards the powerlifter. And obviously, Louis Simmons developed world-class powerlifters, record-breaking powerlifters, and so this method really did work for his athletes, and it has a lot of great qualities within it as a system to develop everyday strength for everyday athletes. And so those methods that he outlined were plain and simple the max effort method, and it sounds exactly like what it is, where he utilized heavy, low-rep work to build absolute max strength, which is essential for powerlifting. He also incorporated a lot of dynamic effort movements. And so this was a lot of times a lighter, speed-focused work that was used to develop rate of force development and rate of force production. And he used that method using bands, chains, and the like, using accommodating resistance with lower weight, but allowed his athletes to develop kind of that quicker rate of force development that they needed to accelerate out of a squat or accelerate out of a bench press. And then he also used the repetition method, which is moderate to high rep work that's great for developing hypertrophy and muscular endurance. And again, kind of this concept it existed before Westside, but it was really popularized and made famous by Louis Simmons and Westside Barbell. And it's worked for hundreds of thousands of athletes who have used this method. Now, what are the myths that kind of surround it? Whenever you think Westside, whenever you hear about Westside, a lot of times people will think that, one, it's only for powerlifters. Only powerlifters can use this method because of the max effort work, because of the dynamic effort work. It doesn't work and doesn't translate to other sports or to other, athletes or other populations who are trying to develop, their strength and fitness within the gym. And frankly, we'll kind of get into it, but it's not a powerlifting exclusive system. Conjugate is a framework, right? It's the framework of developing those multiple physical qualities simultaneously. It's not just for powerlifting. Another common myth that you'll see is the use of the bands, chains, and specialty bars. And that really what that did is that created this kind of image that conjugate training is only for advanced lifters. It's only for power lifters who have access to these things. And again, it's just frankly not true. There's certainly ways that you can adapt the conjugate method if you do not have bands, chains, specialty bars. And we'll kind of get into that today. Now, in reality, like I said, conjugate is the framework. It is not a powerlifting exclusive system. It can be used and it can be adapted. Strength athletes, field sport athletes, tactical athletes, general population clients have used it. I'm very aware of a number of professional baseball teams, professional football teams that use this method. I have used it myself and with my clients for almost the past 4 or 5 years, if not more. But I've heard about it for the past 10 years, since I really kind of got started with being a fitness trainer, a personal trainer and strength coach. But I've seen it used by, a great example is I know that the St. Louis Cardinals former strength coach, Pete Prinzi, was a practitioner of the conjugate method with the baseball team. So, so it has been used. It's used still to this day by a number of different sports, a number of different athletes, and a number of different populations. Now, how do you modify it for different goals? How can we? Last week's episode discussed different training splits, and I talked about conjugate with that episode. But how do we adapt that if you only have 3 days a week to train? If you're training a sports team, or if you are training yourself and you only have 3 days a week to train, how can we adapt it? What if your goals are not to have the biggest squat, the biggest bench press, and the biggest deadlift? How can we adapt and modify based off of that? And so we'll kind of get into that today, because ultimately conjugate is really a very well-rounded approach to strength training. Now, this episode is, almost exclusively strength training. I'm not going to get much into conditioning today, even though I do view concurrent training and I do view conditioning work as a huge component of my programming. But the conjugate system is really a kind of a great system to develop strength and athleticism for the everyday athlete. Now, myth number 2 is you can't build muscle training with the conjugate method. Now, why does this myth exist? Right? So many lifters think that conjugate is only about maxing out. It's about moving weight very fast. It's about lifting very heavy weights. And also, Westside emphasized relative strength, getting stronger without gaining unnecessary mass. And so in reality, one of the 3 methods that Louis popularized was the repetition effort method. And that is the hypertrophy driver. He himself emphasized that small muscles limit the big muscles, meaning that hypertrophy work was necessary to be able to develop strength that his powerlifters needed to be able to perform, to break records, and do all those things. Now, another aspect to this is that unilateral work, posterior chain work, and high rep bodybuilding style training are built into conjugate using that repetition method. Also using what Louis would call extra workouts in GPP. There was a lot of posterior chain work through reverse hypers, through back raises, through hamstring and posterior chain work. To develop that, they did a lot of sled pulling, which is unilateral work. They did a lot of single leg and single arm movements, again, unilateral. And they would do high rep band tricep extensions and hamstring curls to really kind of develop those muscles. And now, how do we program hypertrophy within the conjugate system? And we do that through using this higher volume accessory work, choosing strategic exercises to develop lagging muscle groups. We can certainly prioritize our strength work at the beginning of the workout. We can do it at the end of the workout, but those accessories that fall through in there help to develop those smaller muscles, and we can do that through using the repetition work. Now, I like to blend strength and hypertrophy in the conjugate programming the way that I just kind of described. So for more of our performance, like the peak performance program, I like to use the heavy strength work or the dynamic effort work towards the beginning of the workout. And then towards the end, we do a lot of accessory work. If I'm programming more for like a longevity client, someone who maybe wants to get strong, but strength is not their main goal, then a lot of times I'll flip that, where we'll do a big warm up of accessories, maybe a 4 exercise circuit, to really, and in that circuit, we'll do reps of 15, 25, and I call it like a pump and prime, right? So my strength and size protocol program uses this where we like to fill the muscle up with blood and get a really good pump ahead of time. And then now we're kind of pre-fatigued. So whenever we go and hit our squats, or whenever we go and hit our deadlift or our bench press variations for the day, we're not needing to lift nearly as much weight as if we were fresh, because now we're decreasing the injury risk. And it's just a much better paradigm for people who strength is not their primary goal. So really, that's how I try to blend those two together, because I am a big proponent of building strength, but then also I like to have a lot of muscle on my body. I think that muscle is very important for health. And so building that hypertrophy, building the muscle, not only helps with increasing strength, but then it also just makes you look good, right? Like that's what people see. That's what people, and so my programming relates to those everyday athletes who want to be able to perform well, who want to be able to keep up with their kids, but then who also, whenever they take their shirt off at the pool in the summer, they look fantastic because they've got a lot of muscle to kind of go along with that physique as well. So now myth number 3 is speed work, or, in the conjugate method, that's dynamic effort work, is useless for non-powerlifters. And I believe that this is absolutely false. I think that there's absolutely a benefit to training speed and dynamic effort for really every population. I mean, I can't think of one. Like if you look at your adolescent populations, they need it, obviously. Even if you look at your kind of elderly population, so long as it's safe for them to do, there's still a benefit to training fast because we lose those fast twitch muscle fibers as we age. And so there's a benefit to continually training this throughout the lifespan. Now, breaking down what is dynamic effort, let's go into a little bit more detail there. So dynamic effort is lifting submaximal weights, usually I've seen it down to like 25%. I like to use 40 to 70, maybe 75% of 1 RM, using those submaximal weights and training them explosively to train the rate of force development, right? So these are often paired with accommodating resistance, where you'll see the bands and the chains, and those are used to help maintain bar speed throughout the full range of motion. So this is accommodating resistance is great for another podcast topic, but for this, right? So just real simple, bands, chains, as you're doing the movement. So if you're squatting, as you lower, you have, especially with bands, that band is actually pulling you down, and you've got to reverse at the bottom of that movement and explode up. As you explode up, the weight on the bar is going to increase because the band tension is increasing. Chains kind of work similarly. They do not have that pulling down effect that bands do, but chains allow you to have a lighter load at the bottom, and then as you accelerate through the squat, the weight gets heavier at the top. So very similar, but they both serve two different purposes. So why does this method exist? Why they should not train dynamic effort if they're not a power lifter? And critics will argue that moving weights that are light really, really fast don't actually develop strength for raw lifters. And then those dynamic effort days are often misunderstood as just moving weights extremely quickly without any intent behind it. When in reality, speed strength training, which is what dynamic effort is crucial for power production. Rate of force development carries over to athleticism, real world applications like jumping, sprinting, the Olympic lifts. That the quicker that you can produce force, the better you are going to be at doing those types of movements. Dynamic effort can be adapted for athletes and everyday lifters. You don't need to use bands, right? You don't need to use chains. They're not a necessity to be able to do this type of work. Yes, they certainly help. They do increase fatigue. So there's actually certain populations that should not probably use bands and chains. It's not necessary, but you don't need them. That's ultimately the goal. You don't need bands and chains to do this type of work. What you need is incredible intention when doing your dynamic effort movement, and then also incredible execution, maintaining proper technique, proper form throughout the movement, and doing them with high level of intent is going to be far and beyond better than not doing this type of work. So how I like to use dynamic effort in my programming. I love speed squats. I love dynamic effort bench press. I don't always use them, but I'll use trap bar jumps. I'll use a dynamic effort trap bar deadlift. Like I said, I'll use speed squats, but again, we'll take it with bands and we'll focus on just doing it with high level of intent. I've even used it with some overhead pressing in the past. Another way is using kettlebell swings. Kettlebell swings, they provide the weight that's needed, and you've got to produce a lot of force quickly to be able to perform that kettlebell swing. So that's how I kind of like to program them, and I keep dynamic effort in there, especially for the lower body, basically year round. The upper body, a lot of times, certain phases throughout the year, I will kind of get rid of, or we'll phase away from dynamic effort to allow us to focus more on the repetition effort, where hypertrophy in the upper body may be a little bit more beneficial. You don't really need to have a lot of power in the upper body year round. And it's just more fun to kind of switch up the training a little bit. So that's how I like to kind of program that throughout the year. Now, myth number 4 is that conjugate is too complicated. And to be honest, like whenever I first understood the conjugate method, I was like, this makes so much sense. Why aren't we all training like this, right? So the traditional West Side, and I think that a lot of that myth comes from the fact that the traditional West Side did use the bands. They did use the chains. They used the specialty bars. They did box squats. They did box squats with a foam pad. They may have done half squats or partial reps. They included GPP days. They included restoration methods. And when you look at the West Side method, those are the things that they did. But it's actually very, very simple with how they programmed. They would kind of train similar movements, every single week for their accessories. Their dynamic effort movements would basically stay the same. They would just do wave loading, and then the max effort work would change every week. If not, they may have stretched it out 2 to 3 weeks, but really Louis kind of was against keeping those in there for too long. And so the changing up of the exercises, if you're not an elite level powerlifter, you can actually stick with the exercise a little bit longer, right? You don't need to train max effort every single week. You can use submaximal effort where you're using lighter weights and doing sets of 3, 5, 6, whatever it may be. And again, I go back to conjugate is the principle. It's not the rigid template. We can simplify it. We can use straight weight. We can choose basic but effective movements. We can auto-regulate and rotate intensity just the same way that Louis did, but we can do it in a much simpler fashion. And so I have streamlined conjugate training for hybrid athletes, everyday athletes, busy lifters, people who want to still look good. And I've done that by simplifying a lot of these methods. I don't do the same restoration methods, the 12 hours after the lift movements that they would do at Westside. I kind of take away that type of stuff. I still program bands and chains, but I try to simplify it. It's like if you've got the bands and the chains, use them. If you don't, then you don't have to use it. Just do your lift with incredible intent. And that is what's going to allow you to get the most out of that exercise for the day. So that's how I've kind of streamlined it and allowed people who are just training for everyday life to be able to use this method in a much simpler fashion. And then the last and final myth here. So number 5 is that you have to train 6 or 7 days a week, multiple times a day for conjugate to work. And again, this kind of goes back to the conjugate system that Westside used was based on 4 main training days and then a lot of extra GPP work or general physical preparedness work. And so people assume that you have to do the max effort upper, max effort lower, dynamic effort upper, dynamic effort lower, 4 days a week of those, plus recovery or extra workouts in order for you to make progress. And again, if you want to make progress like elite level powerlifter, then some of this stuff may be needed, but we can definitely condense that down. And so what I've done is I've broken the conjugate method down to basically 3 days a week or 4 days a week in my programming, and people are still able to see results. I allow everyday athletes, busy lifters, dads, wives, hybrid athletes to modify conjugate, the principles of conjugate, to fit their lifestyle. So they can still train the way that they want. They can still do all the things throughout their life, but they're not spending every day, multiple times a day in the gym. They can still see results by doing it that way. And then I've also further adapted that to using full body conjugate days. So I have a full body training program where we still use max effort and submaximal effort lifts. We still use the dynamic effort lifts. We still use the repetition effort lifts, but we've used these in more of a full body protocol instead of just that basic traditional upper lower split. And so I've used this condensed conjugate approach by modifying it for real world application, people who are athletes that don't need to be in the gym 3 days a week, people who are, take like an MMA fighter or a tactical athlete, someone who needs to be able to train. They need to be able to be strong. They need to be fast. They need to be athletic and perform well. They don't need to spend 4 days doing upper lower splits. It's a lot easier to recover from the full body days. And it's also, it just fits your schedule so much better. And so to kind of wrap this up, put this all together with a nice little bow on it, conjugate isn't just for powerlifters. It's a versatile strength system and it can be applied to a lot of different goals. I don't believe that it's overly complicated. My programming, I develop templates that I'm allowed to just kind of plug and play, and so I've taken that conjugate protocol and condensed it down. And now it's just fill in the blanks here with how are we going to train max effort this week? How are we going to train dynamic effort this week for upper, for lower? Where are we going to get our hypertrophy work in? And it just requires smart implementation at that point. And then it also requires, the athlete or the client to be able to follow through on performing those exercises with incredible execution and incredible intent. And then third here, it's effective for muscle growth, athleticism, and strength. It's not just maximal powerlifting totals. We can get athletes stronger by using this method. They don't need to max out every single week. We can get them to be powerful using the dynamic effort method, and we can build a lot of muscle by using the repetition effort method. And so that's ultimately the key takeaways, from this is that this can be a very versatile program if you use it correctly. Now, my advice, if you are looking to get started with conjugate training, is to start with a simplified approach. You don't need to use every tool or every method at once. We can scale it back. We don't need to use bands and chains if you're just starting off with dynamic effort method. If you want to develop strength, but you don't want to use the max effort 1 rep max method, then we can certainly start you with just maybe just increasing the weight and lowering the amount of volume that you're doing for those types of movements. And so that's ultimately, kind of a simple way to get you started. And I encourage you to experiment and adapt the conjugate principles to your own training. So if you are a personal trainer who is training other clients and you want to start using more of the conjugate approach, there's definitely ways that it can be adapted for different populations. If you are someone who is training, who is listening to this, that's interested in trying some of my programs, right? We use the conjugate method almost exclusively throughout this because I just think that there's so much benefit to being able to develop strength and hypertrophy and that power and athleticism that comes from doing the types of methods that are within conjugate. And so, ultimately, that's what I would focus on if you're looking to get started with this. So that's it for today's episode of the Everyday Strength Podcast. If you got value from this, do me a favor, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who you think would benefit from it. And if you want more insights, exclusive training tips, and in-depth breakdowns of the latest research and strength conditioning, join my Performance Edge newsletter. It is my free weekly email where I cut through the noise and I break down what actually works when it comes to training, nutrition, and performance. You can sign up for it at hagleystrength.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next time.